Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hazara Committee's online event, Unpacking the Hazara Genocide in the 19th Century. We are honored to have you join us today as we delve into the critical and somber chapter of history. This event aims to shed light on the tragic events that occurred during the reign of Abdurrahman Khan, a period marked by severe persecution and atrocities against the Hazara community. Through this discussion, we hope to provide a deeper understanding of the historical context and the brutal measures employed against the Hazaras during this era. Your presence here signifies the commitment to remembering and acknowledging the suffering endured by the Hazara people. Together, we will explore the past to ensure that such atrocities are never forgotten and to foster a future rooted in justice and empathy. Thank you for being part of this important conversation. This event is organized in a significant collaboration between the Hazara Committee UK and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hazaras, the Duty Legacy and the Alliance for Prevention of Atrocity Crimes. The Hazara Committee is a unique platform working together with the Hazara APPG, representing over 30 Hazara communities and associations across the UK. It is the one single platform that brings all the communities together and provides a network for networking and unity for all of the Hazaras across the UK. The Duty Legacy and the Alliance for the Prevention of Atrocity Crimes, their vision is a world where all states have the means to effectively prevent and respond to atrocity crimes built into their national policy. Their mission, therefore, is to empower policymakers to create and improve national policy with respect to atrocity prevention by providing them with the knowledge and the tools they need to develop their policy. To achieve these, they connect policymakers with survivors, diaspora, civil society, and the academic community. I'm sure James Joseph, the director and the founder of these two organizations, are here with us today. Before we go ahead with the introduction of the event, I want to propose a 1-minute silence honoring the recent victims of the Hazara Genocide, the 14 Hazaras who were mercilessly and brutally killed in Daikundi, Afghanistan on the 12th of September 2024. Please join me in a 1-minute silence honoring the recent victims. Thank you all very much. It is important to honor and respect those who have lost their lives as a result of the targeted attacks against the Hazaras. It sends us a message that the Hazara Genocide and the atrocities against Hazaras continue to happen to this day. The purpose of this session today is, in part 1, to unpack the atrocities committed against the Hazaras in the 19th century during Abdurrahman Khan's reign, and in part 2, delve into why these atrocities committed against the Hazaras are classified as a genocide. This is the start of a series of events by the Hazara Committee UK to deep dive into understanding the atrocities committed against the Hazaras throughout the history from an academic perspective, with engaging with those who have dedicated their full or part of their career to the history of Hazaras and their struggles. To expand further On the continuation of this conversation, we will have a quarterly debate in the UK Parliament on the situation of Hazaras. HCUK and APPG Hazaras will provide the Member of the Parliament with an update report on the situation of Hazaras in Afghanistan. Please keep an eye on our social media pages. That is both Hazara Committee and APPG Hazaras for updates. And with that, allow me to welcome and introduce our two guest speakers today. First, we have Dr. Nematullah Ibrahimi. Dr. Nematullah Ibrahimi is a senior lecturer at the University Relations at the La Trobe University. He teaches subjects on Middle East politics, international organizations, and security. His research interests include political violence, peace building, post-conflict political orders, social movement and nationalism, and ethnic politics and human rights and traditional justice. He is the author of The Hazaras and the Afghan State, Rebellion, Exclusion, and the Struggle for Recognition. The book is available online. It provides a fresh account of both the strategies and the tactics of the Afghan state and how the Hazaras have responded to them, focusing on three key phenomena: Hazara rebellion and resistance to the intrusion of the Afghan state in the 19th century, the incorporation of the Hazara homeland into Afghanistan in the 1890s and their subsequent marginalization and exclusion, and the Hazaras' ethnic mobilization and a struggle for recognition in recent decades. Thank you for being here, Dr. Nematullah. And our second guest speaker is Bismillah Alizadeh, who is a PhD student at the University of Surrey in London. His research focuses on the demands of decentralization amongst the Hazaras of Afghanistan between 1992 and 2021. His overall research interests include decentralization, political settlement, post-conflict institutional design, political participation, ethnic politics, and conflict. His latest publication is the research report titled "We Will Make Pakistan Their Graveyard: Systematic Attacks Against the Shia Hazaras of Quetta, Pakistan between 1999 and 2022. The report is an outcome of an 8-month research to present a comprehensive account of the systematic attacks and chronology of the attacks against the Shia Hazaras in Pakistan's Balochistan in general and Quetta in particular. The report also provides a critical discussion of framing of these attacks and shed light on their consequences on individual, family, and community levels. The report is available on and was published by Prestige Research Institute and is available on HCUK, all social media platforms. Thank you for being here, Mr. Alizadeh. We will begin with the first part of the our session today, delving into what happened to the Hazaras during the Abdurrahman Khan's reign. Starting with you, Dr. Ibrahimi, can you provide an overview of the historical context during Abdurrahman Khan's reign?
It is an honor to be part of this conversation. Thank you to the Hazara committees in the UK, the all-parliamentary friend of Hazaras in the UK Parliament and the Duty Legacy for organizing this event, and also for shedding light on the situation of Hazaras over many years in Afghanistan and also in Pakistan in recent years. So really an honor to be part of this conversation on this really important historical day for the Hazaras in Afghanistan and worldwide. So I think, just to provide a quick historical context for the genocide of Hazaras during the early half of the 1890s, I think it's really important to take into account two main developments that took place in and around Afghanistan during that particular century. The first important one is that it is during this period that Afghanistan is formed as a nation state, the way we see it today. The people of Afghanistan experience it today. It is during this period that Afghanistan's international borders were drawn, and Afghanistan also developed a particular model of centralized government during the reign of Amir Abdurrahman Khan from 1881 to 1880 to 901. And this is also a period of the formation of a new state in Afghanistan, which has given rise to a particular type of internal power dynamics, relations, institutions, and also a new kind of political imagination, which I argue continue to dominate, Afghanistan's politics and history, especially when it comes to the political imagination of what Afghanistan should be like, in the way that should be governed. So although I think many national historians would argue that Afghanistan has a much longer history, some have tried to make the claim, replicate the claim of other historians, other national historians, that Afghanistan has 5,000 years of history, but Afghanistan, its current form, is a very recent phenomenon. It is really during those 2 decades that Afghanistan took its current form. So how was that possible? How did Afghanistan become a state the way we see it today? I think there are 2 important developments that we should take into account. First is the external one. Externally, during this period, towards the second half of the 19th century, we see that Afghanistan is becoming a space which is kind of squeezed between 2 major imperial powers. The Russian imperial power, which takes control of much of Central Asia during the first half of the century, and also the British India also takes control of much of the Indian subcontinent during the first half of the 19th century. And Afghanistan becomes that kind of a space where none of these 2 countries' powers directly controls. Although British India makes an attempt during the first Anglo-Afghan War of 1838 to 1842, but they were eventually unsuccessful, and it became one of the most significant military defeats of British India at that time. And it is during the second attempt from 1878 to 1880 that the British tries to invade Afghanistan again militarily. And that kind of invasion, although overthrows the then ruler of Afghanistan, Amir Ali Khan, but also faces popular rebellions in Kabul and other places. And eventually, the British decides to withdraw from Afghanistan, and they reach an agreement with Amir Abdurrahman Khan, who is one of the several contenders of the throne, from one of this, the ruling dynasty at that time, who agrees to take control of Afghanistan. And then eventually, during those kind of 2 decades of his rule, we also see that Amir Abdurrahman Khan also employs a number of very specific strategies to build a centralized state. And essential to that kind of strategy is the really extensive use of violence, both by the state, but also mobilization of one group against the others. Extensive use of religion, the use of fatwa, declaration of jihad against different groups becomes a very popular tactic of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, and he uses it throughout those 2 decades. And most importantly, during those 2 decades, he also receives quite substantial amount of military but also financial aid from British India annually, because he surrenders the foreign policy of what became Afghanistan to British India, and in return, because British India was more or less confident about Amir Abdurrahman Khan's ability to prevent Russian influence in Afghanistan, they were happy to provide quite substantial amount of military and financial aid. So I think that is the kind of the overall context in which we see this. During those, there were multiple wars, and in one of those major wars was on the Hazaras, which we can pack in greater detail during this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Just briefly on the formation of these governments, was there any role played by the Hazaras in the government, or were they giving any voice or part in the governments?
Well, historically, the Hazaras have played quite prominent roles in the rise and fall of various empires, dynasties in Afghanistan. that includes the Durrani Empire, which became, according to many, the predecessors of modern Afghanistan. Ahmad Shah Durrani, when he founded the Durrani Empire in 1747 in Kandahar. But during the reign of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, there were some Hazaras who played some role in the early years of consolidation of power by Amir Abdurrahman Khan. Because as I mentioned earlier, he was trying to mobilize one group against the others. There were some occasions in which he mobilized Hazaras against others who were challenging Amir Abdurrahman Khan's rule, including some Pashtun tribes in eastern Afghanistan. But eventually it was really during when he turned his attention towards the Hazaras that all of those policies came together and combined. The use of religion, centralization, violence, and that all introduced a particular kind of dynamics that really escalated the intensity of violence that were directed towards the Hazaras, which eventually became genocide.
Thank you. Now we continue talking about what happened to Hazaras during this period, but we rarely talk about what exactly specifically happened to Hazaras in that period. And I want to bring in Mr. Alizadeh to tell us what specific atrocities were committed against the Hazaras during this period.
Well, thank you. It's an honor for me to be part of this discussion and to share a panel with Dr. Saif Ibrahimi, from whom I have learned a lot, both from speaking to him and also from reading his extensive works on the Hazaras and on the situation in Afghanistan generally. The question is big, and I think it's very difficult to go into a lot of details, but I'll try to provide some categories of the crimes that were perpetrated against the Hazaras during those 2 or 3 years. Some of these also actually went on for quite a long time after the war was concluded. Well, the first thing that's very important is the mass dehumanization. The text of the declaration of war against Hazaras that declares them as infidels and irreligious people basically just tries to say that the Hazaras are worthy of only death and enslavement. I'll read parts of this declaration, which is I think very helpful in trying to understand why all of the atrocities that were happening against the Hazaras really were happening. This is a translation by Dr. Robert McChesney from Persian. Parts of that reads, in order to extirpate these irreligious people so that not a trace of them remains in those places and throughout the mountains, and their properties be distributed among the Ghiljai and Durrani tribes, the royal court has approved as its policy that a triumphant army made up of regular and tribal forces from every part of the kingdom of the God-given government should descend upon the soil of the rebel tribes of Hazarajat, so that not a soul, this is very important, not a soul of those wayward tribes be safe nor escape, and that the boys and girls be taken captive and made slaves by every member of the tribes of the Mujahideen of Afghanistan. Therefore, there will be a system of conscription imposed on the tribes of Afghanistan, which will be detailed in individual proclamations. And another part of this reads, they means the soldiers, they should consider it impermissible to show any restraint in killing, plundering, and making captives of the Hazaras, and not to be misled by these people's deceptions. They are to seize all of the weapons of those who have not rebelled and destroy their forts. They are not to leave a single person alive of those who had mutinied and raised their hands against the government. Should that prove difficult, they should so report, so that His Mighty Majesty himself will march with victorious banners flying in that direction, bringing utter ruin to the affairs of the evildoers and leave no person in that country. And by the issuance of this farman, this is the words of Khatib, actually, Faiz Muhammad Khatib, the wise of the world should know that whatever happens to that evil tribe, whatever of the structure of their existence is cast to the wind, and in whosoever's house their widows and orphans wind up. This is part of that farman. That's a very long farman, actually. That provides the basis for this coordinated attack against the Hazaras, which is in every way genocidal. Another thing that's important here is, the rape and atrocities that were committed against women. This was happening both before the start of the war against the Hazaras and during the war, and even after the war. A third, crime, which is important to highlight, is killing on massive scale. In some reports, in some accounts, it's recorded that pyramids of skulls were erected and eyes were gouged and people were skinned alive and all of those atrocities. But so many people lost their lives. Now, we do not know exactly how many people lost their lives, but some estimations show that in some places, as many as 90% of the population were either killed or displaced or sold into slavery. According to Khatib, for instance, in some cases, only 10% of the population were remaining in their place after the war. Another one was mass displacement and enslavement, which was also very huge and massive. In terms of loss of land, for example, it says that some of the sources say that like nearly half of the land of the Hazaras were taken away from them and then distributed to Pashtun tribes, including some Kuchi tribes who had helped the government in the campaign against the Hazaras. The enslavement was also very broad, and tens of thousands of the Hazaras were sold into slavery. Khatib in some places say that there was not a single household in the country who did not have a man or a woman of Hazara as a slave after the war. Another one was taking prisoners of war who were killed, in some cases tortured and exploited in prisons in different places, including Kabul. Land dispossession and demographic engineering, because land was taken away from the Hazaras and then it was given to Pashtun tribes in Uruzgan and in so many other places, particularly Uruzgan, Ajaristan, and Daifulat. And restrictions of means of livelihood. There are reports that the soldiers, they destroyed houses, they even destroyed the trees, as means of livelihood for the local Hazaras in those places. And forced conversion to Sunni Islam and banning the Hazaras from practicing their faith. These were some of the categories of crimes that happened to the Hazaras during those 2 years, between 1992 and 1993, and also most of these continued to happen afterwards for quite a long time.
Thank you. In your response, you refer to Farman. For those who can't speak Farsi, is that an order or declaration? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, well, basically, it's a declaration. Yeah, it's an official declaration sanctioned by religion. So here it's both of political, meaning that it's officially from the government, but it's also religious, meaning that it comes from a religious authority. So it has religious sanction and also political sanction.
Thank you. Dr. Ibrahimi, we've covered the atrocities which were committed against the Hazaras. Now, how did the policies of the king specifically target Hazara community, and how were they implemented in that period?
Well, I think as Mr. Al-Zada really outlined quite well, I think at the center of all of those policies were a very specific dehumanizing language and discourse that was developed, promoted, and systematically spread across Afghanistan using all available means, including state institution, but also religious institution, mosques. So I think I would like to emphasize that all of those farmans or decrees or declarations were often read out during Friday prayers, at the order of Abdurrahman Khan in mosques across Afghanistan. So in terms of what happened, so I think we can see that there are different periods of those kind of 20 years where the Hazaras and Abdurrahman Khan had different kinds of relationships. So during the 1880s, it was mostly one of trying, accommodating, but also manipulating, right? As I said, during those years, some Hazaras were participating in some of Amir Abdurrahman Khan wars in other parts of Afghanistan. But it is the most significant war that Amir Abdurrahman Khan launches against the Hazaras. Mostly takes place between in 1892 and 1893, but it really begins in 1891 when Amir Abdurrahman Khan appoints someone, Sardar Abdul Quddus Khan, as governor of Hazarajat, and he gives him about 10,000 forces. And they ask, he orders them to go towards what they were then called Yagistan, right? This is quite, I think, an interesting way to see, again, part of the kind of bigger language discourses that emerged during that period and justified the eventual genocide of Hazaras. So Yagistan, for those of you who do not speak Dari, means the land of rebels, right? So central to Amir Abdurrahman Khan's war, or justification for the war, was that these people were unruly. They were rebels. They were not accepting the authority of the central state, right? And even to this day, many nationalist historians try to justify that kind of violence because they think it was necessary for the birth of a new Afghanistan, because a lot of these kind of tribes, rural people, they were uncivilized, they were too ignorant to understand the value of a new nation state, right? So, but if you look at the historical record, that is completely baseless, okay? When Amir Abdul Quddus Khan's army arrives in Uruzgan, which is the center of the so-called Yagistan at that time, but it also includes Hazara lands who were part of modern-day Zabul, Helmand, north of Kandahar. But at the center of this is really Uruzgan, which is almost entirely Hazara territory until 1890s, right? So the people of Uruzgan, they surrender, they accept the authority of the Emir without any resistance, without any fighting. But then Abdul Quddus Khan's army starts disarming people, collecting weapons, searching house to house, right? And it is in the course of those kind of searches in Uruzgan, they also start committing abuses, including some abuses towards women, right? So, and it is then that the Hazaras start rebelling against the army.
Yeah.
So, if you look at the kind of empirical evidence, kind of completely changes the narrative. It is rather than people at the local level who are against civilization, integration, all of those rule of law. It is the state which is the source of abuse, when it first arrives in that kind of area. And then Abdul Quddus Khan's army is defeated. Then there's another mobilization in 1892, which I think is the most significant mobilization. According to some estimates, up to 100,000 people are involved. It includes regular forces from the government, but also irregular forces who are mobilized because Amir Abdurrahman Khan promised them that if they participate in the war, they would have a share of the Hazara slaves, loots, but also land in the future. A substantial number of those 100,000 force were, in fact, non-regular army forces, like, tribal militias from different parts of Afghanistan. And when they arrive in Hazara, we should also remember that, Amir Abdurrahman Khan's army is also supported by modern weaponry of that time, right? In comparison to local Hazaras. So they eventually overwhelm. Again, there is abuse. There's another round of rebellion in 1893, which is eventually the final round of rebellion and government suppression. So what happens during those 3 years? We see, massacres of Hazaras across all of those areas. Some of those areas of the so-called Yagistan, some of the tribes are almost completely decimated, right? Either because they were killed or because they were forced to flee, or many of them died of hunger, starvation, right? Disease, right? Which is spread afterwards. So, for example, take the example of Hajaristan, right? Which is now a district of Ghazni, right?
Yeah.
It was entirely Hazara, but it was completely depopulated, right? Many districts are in Uruzgan. So as a result of this, many of the tribes of Hazaras who are named in Faiz Muhammad Khatib's Siraj al-Tawarikh, we cannot fully identify them, or we can only identify a small number of them because they were decimated.
Yeah.
But even other areas which are closer to Kabul traditionally, like Behsud, parts of Ghazni, because they were closer to the centers of power, they were traditionally more under the control of government, and they did not rebel. They were not part of this rebel land.
Yeah.
They were also targeted. Okay? There are figures that up to more than half of the Behsud population, for example, also lost their population because of either killing or forced migration, or they died out of hunger and disease. And then I think maybe very quickly, if I don't go too far, the aids after the war, a central part of that policy is redistribution of these Hazara lands to groups that participated in the war, right? So as a result of these areas, Uruzgan, in almost all of Uruzgan, but also parts of Zabul, Kandahar, north of Helmand, part of Ghazni, they were completely depopulated from the Hazara inhabitants, and those lands were distributed to mainly Pashtun tribes who participated in the war on the Hazaras. And then part of that, I think, kind of genocide is really, I think, important to keep in mind is a campaign to kill all Hazara elites, right? That includes all landholders, who are called mirs, sultan or khan or whatever. They were all rounded up and taken away, right? And then the mullahs, the people who had performed pilgrimages, the people who are known as Haji or Zawar or Karbalain, hundreds and thousands of them were just systematically arrested, rounded up, brought to Kabul. Many of them either killed or forced to die out of starvation and detention in Kabul, right? Yeah. And lastly, Hazaras were taken into slavery in mass. Tens of thousands of Hazara men, women, right, boys and girls were taken from their homes, brought to slave market in Kabul, in Kandahar, where the government was officially taxing, and it was officially illegal, right? The government was collecting tax. They would sell on other transactions on the sale of Hazara slaves, who are then sold either to the market in Afghanistan, or mostly they would end up, being sold to markets in the Indian subcontinent or Central Asia as well. So I think all of those are, I think, very quick, overview of what happened during those 3 years, but also after those 3 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A lot of us don't know that insight, that elements that happened. So thank you for shedding light on that. Now, I'm sat here in a peaceful country. I have everything. I'm just thinking of the era where, a government makes a declaration, that the form of declaration that Mr. Alizadeh talked us about, against the Hazaras and the Hazara, how would I feel if I was there at that time? So, Mr. Alizada, having talked about the atrocities and the way they were implemented, what were the sort of the immediate and long-term impacts of these atrocities on the Hazara population at that time and until now, probably? What impact did it have?
Yeah. Well, one thing that's very important is, unfortunately, the Hazara genocide at the end of the 19th century and also its impacts and consequences is understudied. So that's why it makes it extremely difficult for us to refer to, some literature to see how it impacted the Hazaras immediately and in the long run. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And also the need, to highlight the need for producing such literature, because this is something to be studied in more details. From what we have from the records, historical records that we have, and oral history and all those sources, we can see that the impact was huge. It was huge, and it endured for a very long time. One was the massive human loss and the enduring collective trauma, because it was extremely traumatizing for the Hazaras. Um, and as I alluded to previously, Khatib says that in some places as many as 90% of the population were no longer on their lands after the war. So this was extremely traumatizing, and this trauma was never, acknowledged and never healed. So that's extremely important to keep in mind, and it continues to date. That denial and the lack of healing that continues to date. Another thing that's important in terms of impact is the destruction of local autonomy of the Hazaras, because Hazaras, particularly as Hazaras of Yagistan, as Dr. Asif alluded to, they were autonomous to a large degree. They were autonomous for quite a long time, but that local autonomy was crushed, and the socio-political order of the Hazarajat and the Hazaras was destroyed. As Dr. Seb also mentioned, all of the people who had capacity of sort of social local leadership, socio-political leadership, they were taken away, they were rounded up, tortured, killed. Some of them were sent into exile in other provinces. This was a total destruction of the social fabric and the political organization of the society, in a way that the society was left with no potential in the short term to mobilize itself again. And at that time, the local leaders were replaced with governors and judges and clerics, from the Pashtuns and the Sunnis, who were appointed in Hazarajat in different places. So the entire political, socio-political order was destroyed and then replaced with governors from the Pashtuns. This was extremely difficult for the Hazaras. It has a lot of consequences. The colossal loss of land, and then the new dynamics that came with it, very violently, of course, through, for example, the Kuchis. This is something that was it was set in motion at that time, because the Kuchis were one of the groups who participated in this war, and they were rewarded with lands, among others, of course. And that land issue and the violence that comes with Kuchi incursions in the spring and summer seasons in Hazara, that goes on even today. Another thing that's important is the impoverishment. The impoverishment and extortionate taxation of the Hazaras. In a way, the livelihood of the Hazaras was reduced to bare sort of survival. It's a situation that in social science, many scholars in social science have termed as a social death. Social death is a situation in which, it's the life of a community is reduced to bare minimal survival. It's, some people call it plant life.
Yeah.
So to reduce the life of a community to that situation. Hazaras were in Kabul, for instance, Hazaras were doing the menial work, underpaid, always exploited, and very difficult circumstances at the time. And then this also came with a sort of humiliation because, like Hazaras at the time, before the war, they were like local autonomous people, their own culture and identity and everything. But then post that, and for quite a long time going on, their identity was sort of synonymous with words like, the porters and many other humiliating words, swear words, particularly in places like in urban centers like Kabul, for instance. So that was also important. Persecution remained alive and strong for quite a long time. Hazaras are not allowed to practice their faith. Khatib, for example, records many cases of Hazaras being arrested and then put in prison or tortured because of commemorating Muharram, for instance. Cases of that is recorded in Mazar Sharif in Kabul and in different other places. This is something that later in the second half of the 20th century, Hazaras sort of framed as criminalization of being Hazara.
Yeah.
Sort of the being of this community was criminalized. And most importantly, of course, the lack of healing and the denial. Because denial is important because so many scholars of genocide and genocide studies have talked about denial as being part of the process of genocide. Yeah, people like, for example, Dr. Gregory Stanton, they have talked about denial as the last stage in the process of genocide. That denial has always been there by the state, by the society, by almost everyone, and it continues to date. So these are some of the impacts and consequences of the genocide of the Hazaras. Most of these continue to date, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now you mentioned humiliation. Now, when I was a student in Afghanistan, a kid, the non-Hazaras used to make fun of our facial features, such as a nose and eyes, and is that rooted deep down from a historical perspective of humiliating Hazara, that culture within non-Hazaras?
Yes, of course, yeah. That has it's rooted in the events of those years. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ibrahimi, now when I was growing up in Afghanistan, like many other people in the call, many Hazaras, Kuchis, as Mr. Alizadeh mentioned, used to come to our villages. They used to come there with weapons, and we had nothing to defend ourselves. We just let them to do whatever they like, to the farms, and they could take away anything with them. Now that is the era where not social media like Facebook, Instagram, and X, but we had radio and TV, television for it to be reported. Going back to Abdurrahman Khan's era, are there any personal stories or testimonies from the survivors that highlight the severity of these atrocities committed against the Hazaras?
Thank you. That's, I think, really a great point. Maybe I can come back to the point made by Alizadeh, and that is the impact of the trauma in the genocide on the Hazara, the whole society, especially the destruction of the elite, the literate, the more kind of worldly elements of the Hazara society. I would think of Afghanistan of the 19th century, people who were traveling as far as Karbala to perform pilgrimage. They were also getting to know more about the world. They were also probably a bit more educated, right? They would also be mullahs, right? So I think, are there any personal stories or testimonies? Now I think we are living in the third, fourth, fifth generation of survivors. So, and a lot of those people who fled Afghanistan, fled Hazara areas, some of them went to Pakistan. We know who they are, right? They formed the community in Quetta right now, and some of them went to parts of eastern Iran. But there are also others who went to other parts of the world. We have no idea where they are, right? Or if they have still maintained a kind of collective memory, identity of being part of a broader Hazara community. So I think now you can still, I think there is a very strong sense of attachment, to the land the Hazaras have lost. I remember back in Kabul in the early 2000s, there were a group of people who were mainly coming from the Chopan areas, right? North of Zabul and a part of Orizgal. And they were, kind of maybe third, fourth generation descendants of the survivors. And they were trying to come together and talk about, the land and even possibly get compensation from the government under Hamid Karzai at that time. So that is that kind of story is well and alive, and I have heard of people, but I haven't seen many myself, that people still hold some documents of like ownership if they had paid taxes to the previous rulers before Abdurrahman Khan in those areas, and their descendants are probably now in Pakistan or Iran or in other parts of the world. But overall, when we look at the situation, it is not a one-off event. Right? That it took place, and it should give the Hazaras the chance to heal, revive, survive, reorganize, reflect, and think and write. Right? So it never happened. And therefore, I think while those kind of personal oral histories are quite important, I think they are part of everyday culture. Many Hazaras talk about it, especially those who are displaced.
Yeah.
With the example I mentioned to you, I think it is really, the kind of account that comes from Faiz Muhammad Khatib Hazara, who is really, I think, giving us all of those kind of granular details of what happened. Right? For the record, he was a Hazara who happened to be a court writer during the reign of Amir Habibullah Khan, and he was asked by the Amir to write in official history, and he was given access to the court documents, all of those decrees and farmans that we already discussed, were in the record, and he had direct access to them. And he went through a lot of difficult processes, we know today, but he managed to pass on quite a lot of details about the war, those kind of declarations, and the government reports which are coming through. But unfortunately, from the kind of survivors, we don't have many, because I think a trauma after trauma, displacement after displacement, the Hazaras never were able in a position to write history. It's only, I think, in the 60s and 70s when a new group of literate Hazaras, educated Hazaras, tried to write. And I think it is 60, 70 years after the event. So, and a lot of that, I think, also begins with the reference to Siraj al-Tawarikh by Faiz Muhammad Khatib Hazara.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could you briefly provide an introduction to Siraj al-Tawarikh and the importance of in the history of Hazaras for our listeners here, so they can, if they want to read it, to get an insight in the history of Hazaras?
Well, Siraj al-Tawarikh is really a foundational text for understanding the history of Afghanistan, not only of the Hazaras, but also of Afghanistan more generally. I think, as I already mentioned, it was a book that was commissioned, it's in several volumes, right? That was ordered by Amir Habibullah Khan, who became the successor to Amir Abdurrahman Khan, his son. And he was given access to official government records and documents. And he wrote that history based on those kind of documents and records. There are multiple volumes of it. Later, as other Afghan government officials and regimes tried to find out that there were two kind of challenging the official narrative. They tried to hide it. Some of those volumes were missing, and some of them have been found recently. They have been printed in Persian. And I think, as Mr. Hazara mentioned, two really great historians have done a great job of translating them also into English.
Yeah.
Volume 3, by Robert McChesney and Mahdi, what is his surname? Khorrami, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is also was published by the Brill in recent years. It's a really long book, I think, for those of you who are interested in the history of Afghanistan. So it is not only about the history of Hazaras, but if you really want to learn about the history of Afghanistan, it is formation during those crucial years. This is, Abdurrahman Khan's reign is, the period of foundation of a state, the way we understand it today. So I think it's really, really important text and document. It is widely, regarded as the official, an incredible history book on that period of the history of Afghanistan.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if besides I would like to add anything on Siraj al-Tawari as well.
Yeah, very, very briefly, I think that covers it. I think there is probably one of the most interesting articles in literature on the introduction to Siraj al-Tawari is the introduction to the book, to its translation by the Dr. Robert McChesney and Mahdi Khorrami. So there are like two different introductions. One introduction is to volume 1, 2, and 3, and there's a separate introduction to the conclusion to volume 3 and the volume 4. And overall, this is like the total of it becomes 11 volumes, 11 volume set of the 4 volumes translated into English. For quite a long time, I think Dr. Robert McChesney was a very passionate person who dedicated a lot of his time translating and doing a lot of research on that. And there is a separate introduction that he published in 2016, I think. So there's this book, Afghanistan Through Afghan Eyes. There's one chapter in that book by Dr. Robert McChesney on the life of Faiz Muhammad Khatib Hazara, in which he also goes into details on how it was written. And there's a lot of course, sources in Persian on how this was commissioned, how it was written, and all of the ups and downs that Khatib faced in writing the book. I think it took quite a long time from 1897, 1898 up until 1921, 22.
Right.
It took quite a long time to write.
Thank you. Now, as we know today, next week, there's a lot of protests going on against the Hazara genocide in countries like all across Europe and Canada to raise awareness of the atrocities being committed against the Hazaras in Afghanistan. Now, Mr. Alizadeh, back then there was no media, there was no access to financial means as well to report anything. How did the international community respond to the atrocities committed against the Hazaras at that time?
Well, we don't have a lot of sources on this, unfortunately, or I haven't seen a lot of sources on how this was reflected internationally and how the international actors who were in one or the other way involved in the situations in Afghanistan reacted. So one thing that's important to keep in mind is, that at the time, three powers, 2 of them big, one relatively big, were involved in Afghanistan. One was the British India, the British Empire through the British India. Another was the Russians, the Tsarist Russians, and the third one was the Persians. The Persians at the time who were also an ally of the English. Now, the Russians and the English, the British, they were mostly preoccupied with drawing the boundaries around Afghanistan to finalize this project of a buffer state that would sort of like allow them to live, in peace with one another, sort of, because they were extremely worried about 2 big powers, extremely worried about clashing if they shared border. So that was sort of, as Dr. Seb also mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, that this project of building a state in Afghanistan with defined demarcated boundaries. So this boundary was very important at the time, and the two powers, the two imperial powers, were very much preoccupied with finalizing that thing. So, as you know, in 1893 is the same year when the Duran line was also signed. So they were mostly busy with that. Um, and at the same time, I think for the British and the Russians, internal matters of Afghanistan was not very important. So they left all of the internal matters to the Emir, and they were mostly worried about the foreign policy. So they were like, as long as in foreign policy, Afghanistan is sort of aligned with the interests of the Russians at the time and the British, then they would be okay. They would allow the Emir to deal with its internal affairs as they framed it, in whatever way that he saw fit. So that's generally how it was. We see some reactions, for example, from the King of Persia at the time, who so there was this mujtahid who is a grand religious Judist, who raised this issue of mass killing of the Hazaras with the then Qajari king of Iran, not Iran, Persia at the time, Nasiruddin Shah Qajar.
Yeah.
And then the Mujtahid asked Nasiruddin Shah Qajar to ask for an explanation from the state of Afghanistan, but not directly, through the English. So he sent a letter to the English in the subcontinent, to the viceroy, basically, asking him to ask the Emir of Afghanistan for an explanation. It was not more than that. It was just to ask for an explanation of why, the Shias, only Shias, and why the Shias. There was no mention of the Hazaras. Shias are being killed in Afghanistan in that proportions. And then basically Amir Abdurrahman, brought together some non-Hazara Shias from Kabul who had close ties with the court in Kabul, to just write on behalf of the Shias of Afghanistan that there is no such thing going on as exterminating Shias or whatever.
Yeah.
So they wrote that letter and then sent it to the King of Persia, and that was settled in a way, in that way. We can also see that this issue was raised in some of the newspapers at the time in the UK, in England.
Yeah.
But that was also, it just was not that important for the empire. So generally there wasn't much of a reaction, because it was relegated as an internal matter of the King of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
There are some cases that, they consult the Emir, they advise the Emir not to be so harsh, but nothing more than that.
Nothing more than that. Thank you. We have sort of provided a brief, comprehensive understanding of the historical events. In part two, we'll be emphasizing on the importance of these events as a genocide and awareness of it. Why we think a genocide took place and the importance of raising awareness, especially in the West, but also to focus on the Hazaras new generation who are not aware of these atrocities specifically committed against Hazaras throughout the history, but also the new generation in Afghanistan as well. When we talked about acknowledging and recognizing the vulnerabilities of Hazaras to this day, a lot of the people, in particular the new generation, are not aware of it. So the second part will focus on why we think it's a genocide. So Dr. Ibrahim, as I said earlier, there's a lot of protests going on across the world for citizens to put an emphasis on the members of parliament, on the policymakers, on the government, to look into the case of Hazaras, the atrocities committed to them, and acknowledge that as a genocide. My question is, what evidence supports the classification of these atrocities as a genocide?
Well, I think that's a great question. Maybe the first point to note is that genocide, the way it is defined under international law, is a more recent phenomena than the war by Abdurrahman Khan and the Hazaras. Until the Second World War, international law didn't recognize any particular crime as genocide. So it was during the given experience of Holocaust and everything that happened during the Second World War, a number of activists and scholars, most notably someone called Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish scholar, really championed the cause and introduced a new term, genocide, to international law. So as a result of that, we now have a new UN convention, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, and it came into effect in 1941. So how does that convention defines genocide? Maybe I quickly take a look at that. So Article 2 of that convention defines genocide. In Article 2, genocide means any of the following acts, right? Committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, religious, racial or religious group. Okay? So what are those acts? Killing members of the group, right? According to the Article 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, okay? And deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, again, in whole or in part, okay? Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, right? Yeah. So this is, quite a serious crime, but I think, there's some overlap, the way we, international lawyers would, define it with other modern international crimes, like crimes against humanity, right? But the key idea here is that in those kind of, acts committed with the intent, yeah, right, to destroy a group which is either defined on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, or whatever, right? A defined group. So here, I think, any attempt to make the case that 1890s massacre, enslavement, and forced displacement of Hazaras constitute genocide is we have to prove two things. One is, number one, Hazara should be defined as a group, right? Because under modern international law, Hazaras groups are protected, right? No group should be subjected to those kind of measures, right? One. And second, we should also need to demonstrate that there was an intent, right, to destroy the Hazaras in whole or in part, right? So I think there is a lot of confusion here. And I'm not really a legal scholar, but I'm trying to talk to this as an international relations scholar, right? That there has to be a lot of killings before an event can be described as a genocide. But international law I think the key idea here is in whole or in part, right? So when there is an intent, any of those acts which I listed that are committed with that kind of intention, that may amount to genocide. So now, if we look at the period of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, right, I think we have already discussed quite a bit of that. So I think, what are some of the reasons and evidences that we might bring to make the case that, those acts were in fact genocide? I think the first thing to really remember is, I think it's already mentioned by Mr. Alizada, is the language. Amir Abdurrahman Khan's reign, saw the development, articulation, and deployment of a language which is full of, dehumanizing words, languages directed towards the Hazaras, right? So I think the first thing is maybe you see the main idea, the Hazaras are rebels, they are robbers, they are plunderers, they're anti-civilization, they have been looting, everyone, right? There's some references, attributed to him that Hazaras are like donkeys, right? in all of those kind of dehumanizing language that are used not only during 1891 to 1993, but also throughout his reign, right? And that became a legacy, I think, as we already discussed before. They were used, in more recent subsequent decades as well. And then another key part is, I think, to look at the kind of religious justification. The Hazaras are singled out, right? Using religious language as kafir, like infidel, right? And because of that, they are described as not Muslims, proper Muslims, not within the bound of proper Islam, right? And therefore, there was a fatwa, a religious decree issued by Amir Abdurrahman Khan, who, by the way, declared himself the shadow of God on earth, right? In Afghanistan at least, right? Zillullah, right? So therefore, he, made all of this kind of language. If you put all of this together, right? In addition to all of those kind of practices, mass displacement, mass killings, slavery, right? Mass depopulation, and all of those things, you can, I think, clearly see not only genocide of an ordinary scale, but one that would be comparable, which I have argued in my book in Hazaras and Hazaras that we kindly introduced, it would be something comparable to what happened to Armenians, right? During Turkey, like during the First World War, the intensity, the scope, the nature, and the systematic nature of it. All of that, I think you can see the impact of it is really, I think, from what we have, is quite clear that it was a genocidal campaign.
Thank you very much. Mr. Alizadeh, you specifically talked about the atrocities that were committed against the Hazaras in that period. How would those events during Abdurrahman Khan's reign fit into the broader definition of genocide?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Dr. Saib already covered a lot with regards to the question, but I just want to say, there's no one definition of genocide. I think it's important to emphasize. In the international law, of course, there is one definition of genocide that's generally agreed upon, which is reflected in the 1940 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in the Article 2 of it that Dr. Asif explained. And then 50 years later, in 1998, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court also provides a definition, which is the same definition basically of the 1948 Genocide Convention. So there's one definition, which is a very limited definition of genocide. Well, that's from the international law perspective, but we can also look at the definition of genocide from a more theoretical perspective, from the point of view of the scholars and academics within academia who've been trying to understand the genocide as a category, genocide as a theory. So people who've been working on this have provided multiple other definitions that's much broader than that limited definition in the international law. Now, one of those people is Raphael Lemkin, as Dr. Asif also alluded to. In 1942, he coined the word genocide, and in 1944, he wrote a book. In parts of that book, he just explains genocide in a different way. It's a little bit different. Not a little bit, really. It's too different than what is in the international law. So I'll just try to explain how he understands genocide, because he is the person who introduced the concept and the terminology of genocide overall. So he says, and I'm quoting, "Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. And a nation, later this word, a nation, becomes a group in the international law. A group on the basis of ethnic identity, racial identity, religious identity, uh, and so on. So he said that generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when this is accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. However, he also emphasizes that genocide is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of a national group.
Yeah.
This destruction of essential foundations of the life of a national group is very important, with the aim of annihilating the group themselves. So the objective, he says, of such a plan would be the disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, of language, national feelings, religion, and economic existence of a group. So that's very important to keep in mind. Now we see how broad this goes. It includes concepts that other people um, have termed as, for example, cultural genocide, and all of that. And then he says and emphasizes really that genocide involves destruction of the national patterns of the oppressed group. So destruction of the national patterns, or maybe the traits and characteristics that defines a group. And then imposition of the national patterns of another group, which is the oppressor on this group. This destruction includes political patterns like local institutions of self-government, social patterns like intelligentsia, cultural patterns like language, economic patterns like means of existence, biological patterns like birth rate, religious patterns like disrupting religious influence, and moral patterns like weakening the moral and spiritual resistance of the group. Now, when we look at this broad definition from academia, we see that we see a lot of cases of all of this in the genocide against the Hazaras, both historically, meaning what happened at the end of the 19th century, and currently, really. The destruction of local institutions of self-government, as Dr. Aseb also mentioned, and I also alluded to, the local autonomy and all of the institutions and the individuals who were capable of local leadership, they were all sort of destroyed. Okay, so this is really a case. Social patterns like local intelligentsia, it was also alluded previously that the land people, the people who were educated, the people who had traveled, the people who had the experience, they were also either killed, arrested, taken as political prisoners of war, and all of that. Cultural patterns like language, economic patterns like the means of existence. I just talked about how the trees of the Hazaras, for example, in Hajaristan were uprooted. Khatib has a lot of detailed graphic accounts of how the soldiers did that. Biological patterns, for example, religious patterns like the disruption of religious influences. After the defeat of the Hazaras, all of the mosques across Hazarajat had this mullahs and clerics who were Sunnis, who were appointed by the central government. And they were trying to forcefully convert Hazaras to Sunni branch of Islam, which is Hanafi Sunni. Taliban currently is doing something very similar with, for example, the Ismaili Hazaras. And then the moral patterns, like weakening the moral and spiritual resistance of the group. So we see that, we can see examples of this in the campaign against the Hazaras. So we see that not only because of all of the explanations that Dr. Asif provided, not only because of that, not only according to that international international law definition, but also according to other much broader definitions of genocide. What happened at that time is really a case of genocide. It just ticks all of the
boxes,
all of the boxes in the definition of genocide. One thing that's important here, before it's too long, I think forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is important because I think we can also frame what happened to Hazara boys and girls who were enslaved and given to, the many households who had participated or even not participated in the war against Hazaras.
Yeah.
Amir, in Kabul, he had an exhibition room of the slaves. This was called Jariya Khana. So this was sort of this huge hall exhibition room. There were select good-looking, for example, slaves who Amir kept in this Jariya Khana. And then when Amir had foreign guests, he would take them to a tour to show uh, these captives, these slaves, to them, and then he would sort of reward them, like give some of them to those guests if they accepted. Now, so this is, I think, a case of transferring children of one group to another group in one or the other way. In terms of the language, I just want to add one more thing, which is, that this political language is not only a political language, it was also a religious language, meaning that when they say Yaghi or Ashrar, as they would say,
Yeah.
Ashrar is translated as evildoer by Robert McChesney, and Yaghi is rebel. Now, within the Islamic, like the Sunni Islam theology, and even the Shia Islam theology, if there is an Amir al-Mu'minin, someone who declares himself as commander of the faithful, and who is a Muslim sort of like Amir or leader,
Mhm.
anyone who is rebelling against a sitting Muslim Amir,
Yeah.
who is generally perceived as faithful, now that person or that group should be killed. So this is a sanction coming from the theology, Islamic theology,
Yeah.
that a Yaghi, so this is an important term, a Yaghi should be killed, or a Yaghi is sanctioned to be killed because his blood or her blood is it's just uh, halal or mubah. It's called mubah dam, which is that spilling their blood is sanctioned, it's okay, and there is no punishment if anyone does that. So I think that it's very important to put this Hazara of Yagistan and the rebels and all of that language within that broader sort of theological context, in that Islamic theological framework, and the consequences of that. So
Yeah.
if you categorize someone as rebel, as Yaghi in that sense, then whatever else that comes to it is generally sanctioned.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, when you declare that someone is a Yaghi and someone is not religious, and then you declare jihad from the possession of an Amir, then it becomes religiously incumbent upon the Muslims who were followers of that Amir, who were subjects of the Amir at the time, to do their religious duty. So on the one hand, it's a religious duty of the people who participate in this jihad. On the other hand, there is the incentives, the material incentives that the Amir provides, as
Yeah.
Dr. Asad mentioned, in terms of like the slaves, in terms of the looting, and in terms of the land.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Ibrahim, in my lifetime, what I've seen and witnessed in Afghanistan in 1998, the Taliban commander said the Hazara should go to graveyard. And now in Afghanistan, the very same people are in charge of Afghanistan. I remember when we were in Kabul, Afghanistan, Hazaras used to say goodbye to their families before they leave for work because you never knew whether they're going to come back alive, return alive to their families, or not, because of this repeated sequences of attacks on schools and universities, hospitals, on the road, on the Hazara populations in general. I want to ask you, what are the current challenges faced by the Hazara community as a result of those historical persecution?
Mhm. Well, thank you. I think this is really an important question to be asked. I hope that Mr. Alizada and others can also join the conversation. I think, generally speaking, maybe the general point I would like to make here is that, after Abdurrahman Khan, Hazaras experienced, several decades of exclusion, marginalization, under different regimes. And then in recent decades, especially since the early 1980s, the Hazaras have been trying to, struggling for recognition as citizens of Afghanistan. Right? They have been active players. They have demonstrated their voice and agency in different levels, through politics, but also through civil society, through media, journalism. All of those kind of different means have been used by the Hazaras to try to, articulate their vision for Afghanistan. And Hazaras became quite an important, even though discriminated against during the Republic during 2021 and 2021, 2001 and 2021. But I think in recent years, what we have seen, especially since the return of the Taliban to power, is that the Hazaras are facing what we might, call another sort of, genocidal campaign, which is going on in a slow motion pace, right? So I think that, the latest incident that you mentioned in Daikundi, unfortunately, tragically, on the 12th of September, is the last in a series of such incidents that have targeted the Hazaras in, the area between Daikundi and Ghor, in the highway between Kabul and Kandahar, Wardak, Ghazni, you name all of those places. But also in Kabul, we should remember all of those attacks on Hazara places of worship, mosques, maternity hospital, schools, educational center, all of those things. So I think there is, now again, if you, depending on what kind of definition of genocide you take, whether you take a more kind of legalistic definition, based on international law, or a more kind of broader definition of it, taken by other scholars. I think that you can see, again, remember that genocide is not when a group is killed, right? Eliminated, exterminated, right? When there's a kind of conspiracy to commit, even if no one is killed. I think so. We should be heeding, the warning signs here. I think, and therefore, I think in recent years, what we have seen is the rise of, the campaign of Stop Hazara Genocide, which has been, I think, going on around the world. I think in 2022, especially with more than 10 million tweets, I think it became really quite, a powerful voice to draw attention to that kind of situation in Afghanistan. So I think those kind of targeted attacks are one example of, a more sort of a structural, more sort of multi-dimensional marginalization and persecution that the Hazaras currently face. We see those attacks because they, take life and they come to the news, but there are other dimensions of, everyday marginalization that we do not know much in greater detail because they happen in everyday practices. Take the example of, economic relations. The forceful return of, nomads on Hazaras, displacement of, thousands of Hazara families from their lands in many different provinces of Afghanistan, and the complete exclusion of Hazaras from the, the so-called cabinet of Kabul, Taliban in Kabul, local administration, and the destruction of Hazara cultural symbols. I think most recently we have seen yesterday with the destruction of the, the Mazari roundabout in Kabul. I think the same thing happened with the statue in Bamyan. So all of those are, I think, pointing to the same direction. Even though many of those attacks, like the one in Daikundi, are claimed by the Islamic State, but I think we should also look at the wider situation here. Political exclusion, the new language that dehumanizes Hazaras, which is coming from within the Taliban, certain pro-Taliban figures, Daesh, or so-called Daesh is obviously, quite open about it, but also the structural, social, and economic relations, which is, I think, if you look at all of them together, is trying to recreate the kind of Amir Abdurrahman Khan type, social, economic, and political order in Afghanistan, right? Where groups such as the Hazaras are reduced to the lowest status in the society without any voice, agency, status, rights, and ability to defend themselves, right? And they are subjected to all forms of marginalization and exclusion at different levels. So I think, therefore, I think this is the tragic end of it is, I think, that we are not only talking about a history of genocide of 1890s, but a real threat, a real ongoing campaign to commit genocide now, right? And that happens at a time when Afghanistan lacks, the national government. I think the Hazaras have been really a central force for calling for a liberal, democratic, peaceful, society where rule of law is upheld for everyone, and that has been unsuccessful, given the experience of the previous 20 years. So now, I think we are unfortunately seeing that, and therefore, again, just to conclude, I think Mr. Alzada recently published a very good report in his Lot Rose, if I remember correctly. So, looking at some of those kind of details, for those of you can read part, really strongly recommend to that kind of bigger picture of what the Hazaras are experiencing. But the bigger point maybe I would like to include here is that once a group experiences genocide, unfortunately, genocide studies demonstrate that it is also likely to happen again, because the kind of political ideology, political imagination, political power relations, dynamics that gave rise to the first one may still be existing there. So therefore, I think it is also an opportunity for us to reflect on the present danger as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahimi. Now, Mr. Alizada, you've been talking about protests across Europe happening right now in Berlin, across Germany, and in Canada. Previously, in 2022 as well, we had a protest here in the UK as well. And what we aim to do is to raise awareness of the Hazara genocide across the world. How can raising awareness about the atrocities and the genocide committed against Hazaras contribute to preventing further atrocities against the Hazaras?
Just before this, I just want to add to what Dr. Seb also talked in terms of I think there is a legacy of two different trends that we've been facing since during the 20th century in terms of understanding why the Hazaras are excluded. One of those trends is the nationalistic discourse towards the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century, which was inspired by Nazism, this sort of Nazism nationalism, Aryan nationalism, which was trying to give the state in Afghanistan an identity on the basis of one ethnic group, on the basis of the features of one ethnic group, and trying to generalize that to the entire population of the country. So that's the ethnic sort of radical ethnic discourse, which was sort of trying to make the case that one particular ethnic group, which is the Pashtuns, is the majority in the country, and they're the oldest people who've been living in this geography. Therefore, they're the rightful people to have the government and all of that. So that's one trend. We can go on and on about the details of that. Another trend is in the second half of the 20th century, this radical Sunni Islam. So as a result of these two trends, Hazaras have been sort of delegitimized in participating in the national government. On the one hand, they are a minoritized ethnic group, sort of in the first trend. It's talked about them in a way that they, constitute maybe less than 5%. In some people even wrote journal papers saying that the Hazaras are 5% and 6% and 4%, things like that. And another is that the Hazaras are not Sunnis, and majority of the people in Afghanistan are Sunni Muslims, Hanafi Sunni Muslims, and therefore it's it's the right of the majority to decide, even if you go democratically. So those two, I think, is very important to be addressed in order for the Hazaras to, in order for the situation to allow for participation of different ethnic groups and different religious groups in the political and social life. As Dr. Seb also mentioned, in the last report I wrote about the situation of the Hazaras, one of the findings is, that in the high-ranking, in the high-ranking positions in the Taliban government, the people who are directly or indirectly affiliated with the Al-Qaeda are 6 times more than the Hazaras in the government. This is a report by the Middle East Institute. There's like 49 to 50 people directly or indirectly related to Al-Qaeda, and in the mid to high ranking positions in the Taliban government, and there's only 6 or 7 Hazaras. It's not only Hazaras, Hazaras and Shias. Now you see that 6 times more representation for the people who are directly related to Al-Qaeda. That's the degree of denial for the Shia Hazaras within the present situation. But coming back to the question of how awareness raising can contribute in preventing the future atrocities, one thing that's important is I don't really know if we can yet talk about future atrocities, because whatever atrocities that we've been having is ongoing. The genocide of the Hazaras has never stopped in that sense. So it's a little bit difficult to talk about a future sort of atrocity or future genocide. But anyways, with that aside, I think one thing that's important is establishment of truth. So that's very important in terms of addressing genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity and all of that. So from the point of view of establishing the truth, it's very important. And there is a need, in fact, for whatever that happened to be known and to be documented, and that there should be an evidence base generated and created, all of the documentations and the knowledge to be produced, literature and all of that. So that we should know, what happened and all of the details of what happened. But at the same time, I think to produce literature on how we understand, how do we frame it, and also what made them, inhuman, heinous, inhuman acts. Why were they horrible? So from this perspective of establishing truth around these questions, it's very important to do awareness raising. From another perspective, I think it's also important for healing, because one of the things that's important is healing. And when it comes to healing, recognition is the first step. And for recognition, of course, we need awareness raising. We need that knowledge to be produced about what happened. And from a justice perspective, if we talk about, serving justice and bringing the perpetrators to account, to justice, and then to hold them to account, from that perspective too, it's important to think about recognition, and it's important to think about that documentation and evidence base. And again, I think awareness raising plays a very crucial, integral, key role in this process. And from the prevention point of view also, I think knowledge and the way that we frame what happened, and then recognition, I think they're key. They're very essential. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that, in any genocide, dehumanization happens, but it's also important to rehumanize, all of the accounts of whatever happened, the survivors, and all of that.
Yeah.
So it's also important in terms of like awareness raising, in terms of rehumanization, and in terms of like allowing and helping the victims and the community who has been subjected to genocide to revive itself and to reorganize and to be able to heal and to be able to come together. So I think from all of these different perspectives, it's very important to focus on awareness raising and to produce that knowledge and that evidence base.
Thank you very much. On that point, that is the end of part two. I want to thank everyone.
Can I just make one quick additional point on the last
Of course,
question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I think, I completely agree with everything that Hazara said, but I think it's also important to remember that all of those campaigns are also important for prevention, but also prosecution, right? So remember, under international law, many states, including Afghanistan, almost all European states, they are signatories and parties to the UN Convention, right? They're also parties to the International Criminal Court, which also has jurisdiction over genocide, war crimes against humanity, right? So I think recognition, documentation, healing, all of those are also important, but also given the risks of repetition, ongoing campaign of genocidal violence, I think the states also have a responsibility to prevent. The genocide convention is called a genocide under prevention and punishment, right? So therefore, I think it is important that it is recognized so that states also fulfill their responsibility to prevent and prosecute groups or individuals that are responsible for those kind of acts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very important points raised. Our discussion comes to an end. I want to thank you both and the people who have participated in this very important discussion. Part of what we do as our committee and parliamentary group is to take the conversation out of the Hazara communities and raise awareness outside Hazara communities, and particularly in the Western countries as well, and that our plan to have a quarterly debate meeting in Parliament and report to the members of Parliament an update on the situation of Hazaras, putting forward the reports, the books on Hazaras is part of our strategy to raise awareness, hence this meeting being in English. Talking of our collaboration with external organizations, I want to bring in James Joseph briefly, who is the director of the Duty Legacy and the Alliance for Prevention of Atrocity Crimes, to very briefly talk about his work and his organization in regards to the Hazara community. James.
Thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you to HCUK for hosting this. I'm really not sure what I can add, except to sort of express my gratitude to the speakers and to everyone for attending this discussion. I think one thing I'll just say before that is that despite the sort of passage of time which we've seen since the original genocide of the Hazaras during the 18th century, these injustices are not confined to history. The Hazara community continues to be targeted in violent, systematic attacks in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and elsewhere. And this extremist violence targeting the Hazaras with bombings, killings, marginalization has perpetuated a total environment of fear, insecurity. This is a stark reminder of the enduring threats to the Hazaras, threats that we've heard all too much about today. And I don't want this to be that people go away with a feeling of glib or sort of lackluster hope for what can happen. We know on legal, political, moral grounds this is a genocide, and nobody's in doubt of that. And we still have the ICC has an investigation into Afghanistan and the crimes committed there, and we have other mechanisms and largely it's civil society which can assist. With the takeover in 2021, we saw a massive widespread attacks targeting places of worship, Hazara districts across Afghanistan, and a total impunity which continues to resonate today in what, as Nayatollah described, as a slow motion genocide. And we've witnessed the surge of attacks, bombings, and killings across Kabul, Bamiyan, Mazar-e Sharif, Daikundi, across Pakistan as well. And we're in need of legal protections and safeguards to protect Hazaras, and for countries across Europe to take domestic legislative action to declare the genocide a genocide, so that they can take action within the International Criminal Court and also give their solidarity to the cause. And this pain resonates deeply, not only with Hazara community, but also it echoes through the consciences of those in the diaspora and also those like me who've worked on this cause for so long. And your unwavering spirit in this fight against oppression serves as a beacon of hope, both domestically and internationally, and a call to action for us all. So one thing I want to just go on to, which is, where do we go from here? We know Hazara advocacy is widespread. The launch of networks such as those in Australia and Canada, the Hazara Committee in the UK, which does incredible work, and those across Europe must be coordinated. And we must establish a network to bring these efforts together. Now, the Alliance for the Prevention of Atrocity Crimes, which is under the Duty legacy, brings together groups such as civil society, parliamentarians, academics, legal community, to put together research briefs and to advocate for the establishment of truth commissions, tribunals, and mechanisms to hold those accountable. Now, I'm not saying that the holding of the Taliban or proxies in Afghanistan is going to be an easy task, but it's one that we all must have a hand in. And the All-Party Parliamentary Group in the UK is paramount for giving a voice to communities. The Hazara APPG, as we know it, is a really core body for Hazaras to voice their opinions to parliamentarians and get it onto the legislative agenda. With a change of government here, that gives us even more steps. A number of ministers, well, those who are now ministers, are members of the APPG on Hazara. And as we move past party conference season, which is happening now, we'll set this APPG back up and get members back onboarded. And in the new year, and hopefully up to the new year, start hosting events and groups. But we need those in the diaspora and those in the UK to help us in that task. So what I say to people here is that we need to come together to bring the voice to one place, and or multiple groups or coordinated mechanisms in order to advocate, in order to legislate, in order to create change. Because as much as we can all sit here and show our appreciation and show our solidarity and show our commitment, there is little we can do without legislative, legal, and political change. And that includes changing the political framework for future Afghanistan. So what I say to everyone here today is, this conversation cannot just be this conversation. It has to be a process. And we have to go away from here and think of ways which we can take the academic, the legal, the social, the political, that work that's being done in countries across the world, across the West, to hold Taliban to account, including domestic prosecution, including advocacy, including academic lectures, including explorations of the genocide, as we've seen by two esteemed experts today that I implore you to go and read the works of. But we need to continue this. So after we end this call, reach out to me, reach out to HCUK, reach out to Naimat and Bismillah, and reach out to those who you know in your networks who can help you to continue to advocate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for all the work they've been doing with us in HCUK and the APPG group. Appreciate your hard work. I want to thank our speakers for your time and dedication, but also a very humble thanks from us, from HCUK and APPG, for the work that you're doing. I know both of you somehow on a personal level. I know the work that you do, and we here appreciate it. And thank you very much for your collaboration. And thanks to our audience who have taken the time to join us. Please, when you go away from this meeting, share and raise awareness of the Hazaras and the atrocities committed against them after what you've heard from James, from Mr. Alizada and Dr. Ibrahimi. I hope that has given you an insight into what actually happened to Hazaras during, even though we went overtime. I didn't want to stop our speakers because they were pointing towards a very, very important point, and it would have been a bad idea to stop them halfway through their conversation and miss the words they were saying. I want to thank you all, but I want to mention that the session has been recorded. It will be published on our social media pages for you to revisit, and for those who couldn't make it. And a final thanks to all of you for your time and for your efforts and contribution. I will end the meeting unless Dr. Ibrahimi or Mr. Alizada, if you have got any final comments.
Let me just thank you for the opportunity. Really wonderful. I think echo James in the last point as well. It's been already powerful.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Alizada?
I would also thank you for organizing this, and thank Dr. Ibrahimi for coming. Although it's too late, I think, where he is in Australia. And I hope that the discussion that we started today can go on, because we need to cover so much in terms of like what happened historically, but also what happened more recently. There is so much to be covered. There's so many questions to be engaged with. So I hope that we can have more chances in future to be able to discuss and to continue this debate.
Thank you very much. As promised, this is only the start of a series of conversations we're going to have on Hazara Genocide. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time. Sorry we don't have time for questions. Appreciate your hard work, and wherever you are, have a good morning, evening, or afternoon. Thank you all.